Morning everyone. So today we're going to be looking at the nervous system. So your do now activity for today is about the senses. So I would like you to match each of these senses to the body part they're linked to. So there's 5 senses, 5 body parts, so you can just match the arrows up, and then we'll go through the answers in a second. Okay, so hopefully you've answered that. So for sight, we use our eyes. For smell, we use our nose. For hearing, we use our ears. For touch, we use our skin. And for taste, we use our tongue. Okay, so there's 5 answers there, so give yourselves a mark out of 5 if you got those right. And then today, so as I mentioned, we're looking at the nervous system. So the date today is dydd Mercher 3 Chwefror. Your learning objective for today is to understand how an impulse is carried around the nervous system. And your keywords for today are senses, reflex arc, neuron, and impulse. So first off, let's look at the human nervous system as a whole. The human nervous system consists of 2 different types of nervous system. The central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is the nerve cells that carry the information to or from the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is sort of like the main control, and then it sends information out to the peripheral nervous system that takes it round the different parts of the body. Information is brought to the central nervous system and taken away by nerves, which are bundles of neurons. So a neuron is this picture on the side of the page. Neurons are long cells which carry electrical signals along their length. These electrical signals are called impulses. So I'll just show you here that the impulse would go down the length of the neuron and out to one of the tips like that. So that's how the impulse would travel through the neuron. And then neurons connect together. They meet at a synapse, so there is a tiny gap, and then another nerve ending would be there like that, and then the impulse would carry on through that one. So the signal passes chemically across the synapse to the next neuron where the impulse continues. So it's important to remember that word, chemically, across the synapse. Okay, so there are 3 types of neuron: motor neurons, sensory neurons, and relay neurons. So we'll look at how those work a bit more in a minute. So review 1, there's 4 questions, so if you could pause the video here and answer them in your class notebook assignment. So pause the video here to go answer those, and then come back to the video and I'll go through them in a second. Okay, so hopefully you've answered those. So the answer to question 1, what are the parts that make up the central nervous system? So that would be the brain and the spinal cord. It's important that you say spinal cord and not spine. Spine would be incorrect. So spinal cord is correct, spine is not correct. So the brain and the spinal cord. Number 2, what do neurons do? Carry electrical impulses. Number 3, what are the 3 names of the neurons? Motor, sensory, and relay. And number 4, what is a synapse? So a tiny gap at a nerve ending where the impulse chemically travels across. Okay, so those are the answers. Give yourself a mark out of 4 for those, and then we'll move on to the rest of the lesson. Okay, so now we're going to look at sensory organs. So our sensory organs detect changes in the world around us, known as stimuli. So the sensory organs contain groups of specialized cells called receptor cells, which produce electrical impulses in response to specific stimuli. So the sense organs are what we looked at in our starter activity, so skin, tongue, nose, eye and ear. So the senses for those is touch, taste, smell, sight and hearing. Okay, so those are the senses we use for those sensory organs, and the stimulus we would have for each of these sense organs. For skin, it would be temperature, pressure and pain. For the tongue, it would be chemical tastes in food and drink. For the nose, it would be chemical smells in the air. For the eye, it would be light, and for the ear, it would be sound. Okay, so there's receptor cells in each of these sensory organs that would detect those stimuli. So this is how an electrical impulse would travel from being detected by the stimulus to there being a response by the body. So the first thing is the stimulus, so that is something that causes a response by the body. The receptor is the part of the body, so the sensory organ that detects the stimulus. The coordinator, an electrical impulse is sent to a part of the central nervous system telling it to make a response. And as we can see in this picture, that's where our information gets passed through our neurons. So the order goes sensory neuron to relay neuron to motor neuron, and then to the effector, which is a part of the body, usually a muscle or gland, that is told to carry out the response to the stimulus. And the response is the body reacting to the stimulus, for example, moving away from something dangerous. Okay, so the direction, as you can see in this picture, of the impulse is from stimulus to response. Okay, so now we have another review. There's 3 questions, and for this last one, I would like you to write the order, and then this part down here, I would like you to name the order of the neurons that I just went through. Okay, so pause the video here, answer these 3 questions in your class notebook assignment, and then come back and I'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you've answered these 3 questions. So the answers are, for number 1, what do sensory organs detect in the world around us? Stimuli. Okay, so stimulus is the single, and stimuli is the plural, so single, okay, so multiple stimulus is called stimuli. So sensory organs detect stimuli in the world around us. Number 2, what are the cells in the sensory organs? They are the receptor cells. And number 3, what is the order of the pathway that happens in the nervous system when there is a stimulus? So it was stimulus, receptor, coordinator, effector, and response. And the neurons involved in the coordinator stage are the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, and the motor neuron. So you had to get everything in that order to get the mark. So give yourselves a mark out of 4, 1 for each question, and then also for the neurons at the bottom. Okay, so give yourself a mark out of 4, and then we'll move on to the rest of the lesson. So next we're going to look at reflex actions. So a reflex action is a protective, automatic and rapid response to a stimulus. It follows the same general sequence as a normal reaction, but often it does not involve the brain. Instead, the spinal cord coordinates the response so the impulse can reach the effector quickly. So the nerve pathway followed by a reflex action is called a reflex arc, and the process is the same. So stimulus to receptor to sensory neuron to relay neuron to motor neuron to effector to response. Okay, so it's really important that you remember this order of the pathway. So these reflex actions are protective, which means it prevents harmful things from damaging the receptor cells in the sensory organs. They are involuntary, which means you don't have to think about doing it. It happens automatically, like blinking. And they are rapid, so they happen very quickly. Okay, so here's an example. So the receptor cells in the skin detect a stimulus. In this example, it would be heat from a candle. So the heat rises up and the skin detects it. The sensory neuron sends impulses to the relay neuron in the spinal cord. So this red line here is the sensory neuron. There's a synapse to the green one, which is the relay neuron. There's a synapse again to the blue one, which is the motor neuron. So the motor neuron sends impulses to the effector. But as you can see here, this green one also has an arrow pointing up. So the relay neuron doesn't only connect the sensory and the motor neurons, it also sends a message up to the brain. So that's what that arrow going up means. It's the neuron sending a message from the spinal cord to the brain. But it also connects to the motor neuron, which sends the impulse to the effector, and the effector produces the response. So in this case, it is the muscle which would tell the arm to move away from the heat. Okay, so it's really important that you remember that it goes from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron to the motor neuron, and there's a synapse between each neuron. Okay. So synapses, again, are the gap between the ends of neurons. The information crosses this gap using neurotransmitters rather than using electrical impulses. So one neuron releases neurotransmitters into the synapse. They diffuse across the gap and make the other neuron transmit an electrical impulse. Okay, so the information you can see in this picture, that's the neurotransmitter passing from one neuron to the other. Okay, so this is review 3. There's 3 questions. So again, pause the video here and answer these questions in your class notebook assignment, and then come back and I'll go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully you've answered those 3 questions. So I'll answer them now. Number 1, what sort of response does a reflex action have? So it is rapid, automatic, and protective. Okay. Number 2, an impulse travels through 3 neurons. What order are these neurons in? So again, we start with sensory, we move to relay, and then into motor. Okay, so that's the order: sensory neuron to relay neuron to motor neuron. And finally, number 3, how does information travel across a synapse? Diffuses via neurotransmitter. Okay, so give yourself a mark out of 3 for this review, and then we'll move on. Okay, so finally I've set you some exam questions in your class notebook assignment. This QWC is probably the challenge question. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 exam questions to practice. So if you could give those 4 questions a decent attempt, and then hand in your class notebook assignment, and I will mark them all later. Thanks, guys.